Welcome to this lesson on functions and procedure. In C, a function is a section of a code that performs a task and returns a value. So a function returns a value, while a procedure is a part of the code that performs a task but does not return a value. So the difference between functions and procedures is that functions will return a value while procedures will not return any value. Today we're going to learn practically how to declare, define, and call functions. When you want to use a function, the first thing you're required to know is you must be able to know how to declare a function, to define a function, and to call a function. And that is what we're going to do in this lesson. So after I have put these two headers, the standard include hash include stdi and o, standard input and output, and I also declare the standard libraries. I'm going to go straight. The first thing I need to declare function. So I just say function declaration. It's a comment. So the first thing is that I will declare my function. I want to write a program that is going to add two numbers and is going to subtract two numbers. You see, so the first thing is that I'm going to declare a function and say int. So when declaring a function, you put the return type and then you put the function name I want to add, and then now if it has some parameters inside, you put, but if it does not have, you leave it like this. So this is the data, this is the return type for that function, this is the function name, and then we'll have our parameters inside this bracket and we end it here. So I've declared the first function called add. Declaring simply means you're telling the computer that in this my program I'm going to use a function that is called add, and the return type of that function is int. See, that's basically what you tell the computer. And since I'm using two functions, I want to use two functions, I'll put another function called sub, and then it goes the same. So I have declared my functions. So I'm going to use these two functions inside. I've declared my function. The next thing is that the program always begins running from the main function. So initially you have a main function. In the code block, you already have a main function there. So your program will start running from your main function. So the use of the main function is to call. You see, so after I'm going to define my functions after the main function. When I want to use the functions will be used only when they are called from the main function. It's very important to know that point. Now, functions will return a value, while procedures will not return a value, because they always use those two words interchangeably. But really, they ask you that what's the difference between functions and procedures. You're going to tell them that a function is a group of statements that perform a task and return a value, while a procedure is a group of statements that will perform a task and it will not return any value. So this is our main function here. So after the main function, now I'm going to define my function definition. Function definition. So I'm going to now define the first function that I'm talking about called add. So this function called add, basically I want it to add two numbers. So I want to format my work. So this the function called add. I want to now write the code for it to add two numbers. I'm just going to say printf this function adds two numbers. This function adds two numbers. Next thing I'm going to printf 32 and there are two numbers 1 and 32 numbers 1 by 1. So scanf scanf percentage d for the first placeholder for the first number. Percentage d means integer percentage d, and then I can just say num1 and num2. These are the two variables, but before I use these variables up, I need to declare them here. Int num1 and num2, and it's a third variable I need to use called sum. So get the sum of these two numbers. I need to put the address of the first number and the address of the second number, and then I can say sum equals to num1 plus num2, num1 plus num2. And the last thing I need to display printf is a percentage num1, let's start for the first number, plus percentage num2 is equals to sum. That is the next placeholder. I'm just going to come here and I'll say num1 num2 sum, close it. So this function basically will receive two numbers. Input it. This function called add will receive two numbers from the user. Keep the first number in this variable, keep the second number in this variable. It adds the two numbers and then keeps in this variable called sum, and it displays the answer down here. So if I run this program now, notice that nothing will be shown in the output because the output has no statement. You see, this is the main function. I told you the program runs from the main function. If I build this program and run it, it runs, but really, you see, there's nothing in the output, because when the program runs now, the compiler goes in this main function to start executing code, and it finds nothing. So what are we going to do now? The next is that we have to call this function called add. We need to call this function in the main function. So after you've declared your function, you define your function as such, the last thing you're going to do now inside the main function, so functions are called inside the main function. I'm going to say function calling. So to call our function is simple. I'll just call, if I just put the data type, we don't call using the data type. I will just, the name of the function is add. I will just say add, open my bracket, and I close. You see, doing this calls the function. So this statement like that will call the function. So when the program starts running, it enters the main function. The first thing is that it's going to now, what is inside the main function? This function called add. So it will now just come down here and then now execute this statement. You see, so if I build and run, that's exactly what has happened. This function adds, let me put the output to be in order, terminate this. Here's I am. So just build and run. This function adds two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one. If I enter 5 and I enter 6, 3 and 6, so 3 plus 6 is equals to 9. So the answer is 9. It has called this function in the main function and executed this code. What if I want to now write the other function? I want to define the other function for subtracting two numbers. It's simple. I will just come here. I will define my function for subtracting, which is as such. what I can do now is I can just copy this code and edit it. It's no need writing. Control C and then Control V. So I will just say this function subtract two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one, and I'll come here and I'll say minus. Instead of putting at addition here, I'll put minus here, and that is that. So I want to add two numbers. What I want to do is that I want to add my first two numbers, and then when I add numbers, I want to subtract, and then I want to subtract the next two numbers. So let me run it again one more time. I want to add 3 and 4. You see, 3 plus 4 is 7. So what if I want to subtract two numbers after adding these two numbers? It's simple. I will just after the main function here, after I have called this add function, I'm going to now also call this function called sub. So if I call this function called sub after add, so after adding the two numbers, it's going to now get into the subtraction function and then now execute this code right now here. So after adding now, it will now tell me that I need to also subtract two numbers. If I put 2 and I put 5, let me put all of this thing on new line so the output will look neat. \n here, \n. I just want to put this stuff so that it should be neat. Should be neat. Build and run. This function adds two numbers. So if I put 5 and I put 7, 5 plus 7 is 12. Now it has done the function for adding. Now I want it to subtract. Now it has to now access this function called subtracting. That's why it says this function subtracts two numbers. So after that's executed this first function, it's going to execute the next function. This function subtracts two numbers. I say enter your number one by one. If I say put 5, if I put 5 and then I put 7, you see, notice that it says 5 minus 7 is -2. So functions help you to write your code one time. You define your code one time and then you can call it 1,000 times. So if I just come now here, if I copy this two statements, copy, Control C, and I paste. If I paste them a couple of times, notice what it's going to do. So I have called the addition function here. After I call the subtraction function, I call the addition function. After I call the subtraction function, and I call the addition function, and I call the subtraction function. So let's execute this code and see how it works. So if I build and run, see what it does. Enter this function adds two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one. If I enter 2 and I enter 2, 2 plus 2 is 4. You see, it's done with this first function. Now go to the second function, subtraction. This function subtracts two numbers. Enter your numbers one by one. If I enter 2 and I enter 2, the answer is 0. Now it now gets to the next function. This function adds two numbers. If I say 3 and 7, 3 plus 7 is 10. It goes now to the next one, subtraction function. This function subtracts two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one. If I say enter 3 and 7, you see, the answer is -4. It goes again. This function adds two numbers, so it is on this other addition function. It calls it again. This function adds two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one. If I enter 13 and I enter 88, 13 plus 88 is 101. Now it gets the last function. This function subtracts two numbers. Enter the numbers one by one. If I enter 13 and 88, the answer is -75. So this is basically the idea. So get it straight. You use functions you call. First of all, you declare your functions we declare our functions right up before the main function. The number of functions you want to use, you first of all declare them. After that, you define your functions. Now you define your functions after your main function. So your main function ends here. You define your functions. Now I've defined the first function called add. I've defined the next function called subtract. And then now the last thing is that you do is that you have to call a function. But I just want to give you a small briefing. What is a procedure? A procedure will not return a value. This is just a crash course. You see, this is just an introductory lesson, but I'm going to go into in detail its procedures and functions. Some people ask that why is it that sometimes they use void instead of the data type there. If I use void here, this is the way to define to declare procedures, because procedures will not return a value while functions will return a value. This is just a rough work, but just see how it works. It's the same thing, just that procedures will not return a value. In the next lesson, we will see how to do for it to return specific values and all of that. So if I do it like this now, therefore I'm telling the computer that this add is not more a function, it's a procedure, but it's basically going to do the same thing for this program, because it's just a sample program. If I build and run, it's the same. See, right, it runs the same way, but void means it will return no value. It's for procedures. So if they ask you to write a procedure, you're going to use void. But if they say write a function, you're going to now specify the return type. It is an integer, a character, a string, or a boolean. So that is basically how it works. Feel free to edit the code, adjust the code to suit your task, and you run it. Thank you very much, and see you in the next lesson.